So this is somewhat game changing, but I see industry playing an important role in leading. I think the government plays an important role in trying to identify where we have needs, where we perceive that we might see utility in some of the things that they are developing.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Aerospace Corporation. Today is the final segment of our series on ISAM. That's in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. We've definitely covered a lot of information in this 6-part series, and from a variety of players. From the technical aspects and kind of robotic partnerships, the importance of standards and creating certainty for industry, and both a US national and wider international kind of view of this growing field. So this final installment will showcase how ISAM plays into US national defense. What is that tug of war between policy and technology? What are the DoD priorities in terms of ISAM capabilities? And of course, the dual use dilemma. So we're joined by Margaux Hoar. She's from Aerospace's Defense Systems Group, and she has a rich career in strategic thinking and research. Her guest is Colonel Elvert Gardner. He's Director of Strategy, Policy, and Plans for the U.S. Space Force. Let's go over to Margaux.
Thanks so much, Colleen. I'm so excited today to be with Colonel Gardner. Excuse me, who's the Director for Strategy, Policy, and Plans for the headquarters of the U.S. Space Force. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Margaux. I'm happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. So one of your roles as the Director for Strategy, Policy, and Plans is to take big ideas that are kind of floating around DoD and translate them for the Space Force. So can you help translate for us some of the acronyms that we hear? SAML, SAML, S and ML, right? What's the difference? How do we think about what they mean? And then what do they mean for the U.S. Space Force?
Right. So thank you for that question. There's definitely an alphabet soup out there when it comes to this particular topic area. So what I offer for you is SML. Space Mobility and Logistics is a term I've heard Space Systems Command use this term quite a bit, and they also use SAML as perhaps the term of art. Okay. And then SAML, you have your space access, mobility, and logistics. And there are even some terms that are out there outside of the Pentagon, like ISAM and OSAM, that really focus a lot of attention on assembly, manufacturing in space or on orbit is the O in that OSAM piece. Okay. So there's a range of different people who are participating in this space, if you will, and they use different terms of art, and it can get a little bit confusing. It's important to recognize also that we don't use these terms with great precision. So someone may say ISAM, and they may not specifically be addressing the assembly and manufacturing consideration for it. And it may actually be inclusive of what we think of as SAML. So for those who participate in this area or who are admiring what's happening in this area, it's just important to recognize there are a suite of terms. Sure. They're sometimes used interchangeably and not always used with precision. So it's hard for me to say that herein lies all of the distinctions, but it's important to recognize that the A that you hear sometimes is and sometimes the A is assembly. And then typically you will see manufacturing as the M, sometimes it's mobility. It depends on who is saying it, what they mean by that. The key is ask for clarity on those terms. Another key is all of this is emerging technology. We are right on the cusp of all that is going to be this explosive and perhaps even disruptive growth. As we learn more, as this technology begins to advance, we will fall into more mature thinking on the words that we choose to use to describe these things. So the terms that we have today, the terms of art that we're using, they are evolving. Now, what I will offer is what we use is SAML as a service. Okay. And in our Space Doctrine publication 3.0, that's where you will find an attempt at a definition for that. And we also have a mission area team that focuses in on where are we going with this specific mission set, if you choose to use that term.
Okay, thank you. So I want to pull on the thread about emerging tech. There's kind of this truism that the technology precedes the policy in many cases, right?
Yes.
So is there a way to get ahead of that when we're talking about space access, mobility, and logistics? Or how are you thinking about making sure that the policy keeps up with the technology if this is an evolving area?
I appreciate the piece on the pace of technology versus policy. And it's true, my observation is that technology will often run at a faster pace than policy. And the key for policy is to make sure it doesn't fall too far behind.
Okay.
So in this case, everything is so nascent. We have to be careful about policy treatments this early on. We want to make sure that we strike an important sweet spot that allows for innovation and creativity, but has just the right touch, a light touch of guardrails to provide clarification.
Okay.
So what I think is needed with that light touch, we might imagine having the prelude to policy that would codify things like who are the players, who are some of the actors that are out there that are participating when it comes to SAML or ISAM or OSAM. What are their roles? What are their responsibilities? What are their authorities? These are the kinds of things that we might begin to do a light touch on. But in terms of making more classical, deeper policy stances, it might be, in my personal estimation, it might be a little premature to go down that road because we just don't know exactly what's going to emerge. But there's things like licensing.
Sure.
We need to figure out who's going to be responsible for providing those licenses. Where do people go to get those licenses? Are there particular activities that require a special type of license? Those are the kinds of things that we need to work our way through and begin to think deliberately about from a policy perspective.
And then those decisions are probably going to be particularly impactful to the commercial sector. How is the commercial sector playing in space access, mobility, and logistics when we think about what the Space Force and I guess DoD as a whole wants to do up there?
I think commercial is a very important partner, participant, and leader in this technology.
Okay.
The government is not necessarily leading this effort. This is a commercially driven venture where you have various different companies that are out there exploring the art of the possible as it applies to what we can do in orbit. So this is somewhat game changing, but I see industry playing an important role in leading. I think the government plays an important role in trying to identify where we have needs, where we perceive that we might see utility in some of the things that they are developing, and having conversations back and forth so that we can position ourselves to be a good customer and get the kinds of goods and services that we hope to derive from this emerging technology.
What's an example of commercial technology in this space that would have military utility?
Refueling.
Okay.
That's a pretty easy one to roll right off the tongue. Today, our paradigm, and I want to speak of these things from a paradigm perspective.
Okay.
The way we do business today is we take big, heavy stuff, strap it onto a rocket, if you will, and that's 20% of our weight, and the other 80% is fuel. And we do this big lift and get things into orbit, and then we use them until the batteries die or until we run out of fuel.
Okay.
It is fundamentally game-changing in my estimation as someone who ponders and fancies himself to be a strategist when those rules are no longer applicable. If I'm not concerned about fuel because I can refuel, now I have greater options in terms of what I do with that satellite. It need not be beheld to Kepler. If I want to move, I move.
Right.
With safety and security and all those things in mind. But if there's a need for me operationally to be able to do something, I need not be constrained by, well, I'm going to burn fuel.
Right.
it's similar in some ways for me. If I use the example of aircraft, you fly with a fighter jet, you refuel, and you do the fighter maneuvers, and you satisfy the mission that needs to be had. And yes, you need to keep your eye on the fuel tank, of course, but there's always that tanker that's out there somewhere to be able to address that issue so that you can focus on the mission at hand.
Right.
I would love to see us mature into a point where that is our norm, because then terms that we've heard before, like dynamic space operations.
Right. That's what I was going to bring up.
Maneuver without regret that some people talk about. These things become realized, and it changes how we operate. It also changes how we field systems. So, for example, I mentioned refueling. If I have the ability to repair on orbit, which is another service, another capability, I now might revisit, how do I design and build my satellites? If I know that I can go and physically touch a satellite with regularity, it's routine for me to go up to a satellite and be able to provide repair. Maybe I begin to introduce greater modularity into how I actually design my satellites, because now, hey, I've got a new module, a new capability that has emerged. Perhaps I can just simply do a plug and play. I go up, I do a swap out. So the possibilities are endless here, but refueling is one where I can see immediate need. The ability to repair is another opportunity that has great military utility. And then there are other things that will have perhaps more universal utility, things like the ability to grab a satellite and move a dead satellite into a graveyard orbit or push it down for deorbiting.
So I want to get back to that in a minute, but first I want to talk about the refueling and the repair and the modularity. And I wanted to get your thoughts. I keep thinking about what I would call like the iPhone challenge or the iPhone dilemma, right? Which is a new iPhone comes out, but you have your old iPhone. You can get a new screen on your old iPhone. Sometimes, right, if you find the right vendor, you can replace the battery on your iPhone, right? Like, so how do you decide when, or what is the framework for thinking about when you want something new, you want to put something new on orbit, versus when you want to refuel or update what's already up there?
Right. So that's something that we're going to have to think deeply about, because I will offer that there's perhaps a tension that will emerge at some point here in the near future. As we look at the ability to do life extension, which is that whole suite of capabilities that I just talked about, refueling and repair and those types of activities. As we look to do life extension, we will wrestle with, when we design this satellite, are we designing this satellite for longevity? Or are we designing this satellite in a way that is inexpensive and perhaps disposable, so that I can do things like rapid technology refresh? I have to choose perhaps between those two things and wrestle with, where do I want to go? But for those things that require me to have longevity, then those are the things that I might want to do some sort of life extension. And then occasionally things break. And so you also want to retain the ability to be able to repair something that you did plan on using for longer than it actually lasted. But there will be a natural consideration on, is it cheaper to simply launch another and replace it? Or do we want to invest in capabilities that allow us to be able to do the repairs? And I think the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle, where we're going to want to be able to do both of those going forward.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Now to go back to the grappling, that is very useful for moving dead satellites out of the way. One can also imagine that there are dual uses for capabilities like that. So how do you, in terms of strategy and policy, think about these dual use capabilities in the SAML space?
Thank you for introducing dual use into this conversation, because that's something we definitely have to talk about.
Sure.
There is utility, and we will watch with great interest as some of this emerging technology that has dual use continues to mature. And where there's military utility, we should take that. But that's a double-edged sword, this idea of dual use. It could, if I look at SJ-21 from China. So what China did was they had this arm, they have a satellite, they go up, they grab a satellite, dead satellite, move it, put it into a disposable orbit. From a safety, security, sustainability of space perspective, you might look at that and say, well, that's great. We have capabilities that are emerging that allow us to remove dead satellites. And you would be right. And with this uniform on, I also have a responsibility to look at it and imagine, well, could that also be used as a weapon?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is yes. There's a possibility that you could take that same satellite, and it's not a cooperative juncture at all, venture, I should say, and you pull up to a satellite and you simply grab it and take it hostage, kidnap it, however you want to use that term, and now you push that into an unusable orbit.
Yeah.
And therein lies a possibility too. So from a policy perspective to your question, we will need to wrestle with what are the policies, what are the strategies that we have in recognizing that these capabilities exist, and how do we deal with those? People will have conversations inevitably about norms and responsible use, and that's an appropriate conversation for us to have. Others will have conversations about going a bit further and talking about treaties and perhaps even arms control. Those will be a little more difficult conversations to have.
Sure.
In part because how might we choose to ban or restrict technology? That's a difficult venture. What's perhaps less difficult is to have discussions about constraining verifiable behavior. And therein lies an opportunity for us from a policy perspective, not just domestically, but even as we begin to have international fora where we're talking about responsible use of space and norms of behavior, these things will begin to bubble up. These technologies will bubble up into those fora as part of the conversation going forward.
And I imagine that is also when we're going to have to start to be a little bit more precise with our language, right? When we start talking about norms and having these international agreements.
To a point.
Okay.
Yes, there's opportunity for better precision. But my sense is when we get into international fora, while we want to have some general recognition of what words mean, there is sometimes some reticence on being too precise in what we say and how we define things. So if I were to use the term space weapon, well, that might conjure in your mind a certain image, as it would in mine, and they probably would be similar enough. But then if I go into an international fora and I say space weapon, it's going to mean different things to different people. And so there'll be a natural attempt to say, let's define this. But if you go down the road and you say, I'm going to have an exquisite definition of what constitutes a space weapon, the more precise I am, the easier it is to find a loophole and work my way around.
That's fair.
The looser I am in my terminology, everything's a weapon. So it's very difficult sometimes to pin down some terms in the international forum when we're trying to establish rules. And we always want to preserve some flexibility of what it is that we want to be able to do. And so we don't want to be overly constraining in our use of tight words that would preclude us from being able to do some of the things that might be in our national interest.
Since we're talking about international fora, what is the role of allies and partners in Space Force's plans or DoD plans for SAML and what we want to accomplish up there and what we need to accomplish?
Our allies and partners will absolutely play an important role, as they do in many of our DoD ventures. Japan comes to mind with some of the efforts that they have. We will want to look at spacefaring nations and identify what capabilities they have, what are they thinking, how can we partner, how can we divide and conquer, if you will. But there will certainly be an opportunity for joint ventures as well as mutually beneficial exclusive ventures that we should look at going forward. So I would say that allies, partners will play a very important role going forward.
Okay. And then, right, whenever we talk about allies and partners, we can also talk about the flip side, which is adversaries. What's their role here?
I think that there will be a natural action-reaction that's going to take place with some of the things that happen as China develops capabilities. We will look at them through two lenses, the lenses that I mentioned before. Agnostically, I might look at that and say, okay, I can see that for what it is or for what they say that it is. But I also have a responsibility as one who is responsible for securing our nation's interests in, from, and through space per our mission. We'll have to look at that and say, well, how else might that be used? And what they develop, what they show that they can do will dictate how we must respond and what capabilities we might need to have to hopefully guard against or perhaps neutralize those capabilities that they show us.
Okay.
So their actions and our actions will find themselves into this evolving loop of action, reaction on who's going to do what, how will we respond, how will they respond. There will be some of that will play out as SAML and all of these on-orbit capabilities continue to emerge and mature.
And that kind of plays into what the Chief of Space Operations has described as competitive endurance.
Yes.
So I'm sure many in the audience are aware, but for those who are less familiar, can you tell us about what competitive endurance is and how that plays into space access?
Right. So General Saltzman's competitive endurance is a framework of thinking. Perhaps some might call it a strategy, but certainly a framework of orienting our mindset on how we need to think about space. And so one of the things that we need to make sure that we do is that we never have anything that would resemble a space equivalent of a Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
And so that means that we need to keep our eye on the ball, recognize what's happening within the domain, and avoid operational surprise. We cannot afford to be in a scenario where something emerges suddenly and we find ourselves under attack in a way that we had not anticipated was even possible. Because now we're squarely on our heels and we're fully in defensive mode. And if we're in defensive mode and we're taking losses, then we can't do our job and we can't contribute to the joint fight. And we want to be able to do that because that's part of our job and our role here is to be able to defend the domain, if you will, defend our ability to operate in the domain and maintain mission assurance so that we can contribute in meaningful ways to the joint force that has their own scheme of maneuver that we contribute to. So we have to be able to avoid operational surprise first and foremost, and that means that we have to have awareness, and that's going to require tools and capabilities for us to be able to do that. Another key element of this is denying first mover advantage. And so when we talk about denying first mover advantage, the way I make sense of that phrasing is when I look at the space domain, one might argue that fortune favors the person who goes on the offensive. The person who strikes first, because the ability to defend is difficult. Well, I want to be able to create an alternative reality where that does not exist. So to the extent that I can build resilience and to the extent that I can do life extension,
right,
to the extent that I can do repairs, to the extent that I can take all of this SAML capability that we're talking about here and build greater mission assurance, greater fidelity, greater capability to do the things that I need to be able to do under stress, the greater ability for me to be able to do that lowers the opportunity for the adversary to strike in a meaningful way that would preclude us from being able to respond.
Okay.
And the more that we can do that, I now lower, I temper, I modulate why the adversary would choose to strike me in the first place. For me, that's how I make sense of this idea of denying first mover advantage. SAML will play an important role in contributing to the suite of capabilities that allow us to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
And finally, we have this piece on responsible counter space campaigning. So when we talk about responsible counter space campaigning, we recognize that we don't seek conflict in space. That's not what we seek. But we also recognize it is our job, it is our mission to secure our interests in, from, and through space. And sometimes it requires actions, requires some activities on our part to be able to secure our nation's interests in that regard. But we have to do that with some sort of forethought on what are we doing and what does this mean for the domain. The parameters for conflict in space are not the same as they might be in the air, on land, or on the sea.
Sure.
There are implications to blowing things up in space that are unlike they are in other domains. And we have to think about that and recognize that our first choice can never be to just simply blow things up, because that has long-standing implications for the domain. It can potentially make the domain unusable.
Sure.
So that is not our choice, that we would choose to put that at the forefront of capabilities. So that is where the competitive endurance comes into play.
Okay.
That's how I make sense of it. But that's also where SAML begins to fit in there, because it's going to contribute to each and every one of those threads in very meaningful ways going forward.
Yeah, and even for that third component, right? If you think about responsible campaigning and the implications of blowing something up, if you have a capability that makes it easier to remove debris, that calculus changes a little bit.
It does, and it remains to be seen what that will mean, because it could go in a couple of different directions. I can imagine a future where that might incentivize or disincentivize certain activities. And so we will have to watch with great interest on, as debris removal matures, what does that mean? What are some of the implications of that? It could go in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. So, Colonel Gardner, we talked about competitive endurance, and I know that is General Saltzman's theory of success. How does deterrence play into that?
That's a great question. Let me start with theory of success.
Okay.
Because there is an important play on words there, if you will. It's a theory of success versus a theory of victory. And what's important about that is, when you think of victory, you think winners, you think losers. And that might also conjure in your mind a competition, a conflict that occurs so that one can prevail over the other. And the theory of success is one that starts with an idea of, my preference is to never have to have escalation rise to the point of conflict that extends into space.
Right.
So that is the objective, the goal, the vision behind all of this. And this is where deterrence comes into play.
Right.
So I want to be able to create an image in the mind of the adversary that it is not in his interest to attack us in space. We want to avoid allowing him to imagine a theory of success. And so SAML capabilities that allow us to extend life, to repair, to replenish rapidly, all of these things contribute to a concept of denial of benefits. And denial of benefits, which also kind of seems to weave right back into that competitive endurance tenets that we talked about. I want to ensure that in the mind of the adversary, he looks at what he wants to do and he recognizes how difficult it would be to accomplish it. The more I can create resilience of capabilities, the better I am to withstand any potential attack, to mitigate the severity and potency of any potential attack. And the more that I can do that, the more I can tamp down the incentive to strike, because the strike itself will not achieve the desired outcome. So that's one of the things that I want to be able to do with denial of benefits. And there's other aspects of deterrence that also have to be brought to bear. There's certainly credibility of capability. As SAML comes online, there will be more and more things that we can do. And so it will have an ability to create credible responses in space or to impact the domain. And then there's the idea of denial by punishment, or some people will use the term cost imposition. Additive capabilities will open the aperture for possibilities of what does that look like in space. I will always have the ability to respond at a time and place and domain of our choosing, but with SAML and some of these other capabilities, we'll look at that and then see, okay, what does that mean within the domain itself? There's certainly a conversation to be had there.
It almost reminds me of General Dunford's idea of the boxer stance, right? This ability to be able to pivot and have agility because you have these tools and capabilities available to you.
Having agility within the domain is what I see SAML providing us. We will be less static and a lot more dynamic in terms of the things that we can do. And there absolutely are deterrence implications to that can be brought to bear. And that's part of what I'm excited about, is if we're talking about theories of success and creating an environment where the adversary is not incentivized to strike, I think SAML gives us some abilities there that we haven't had in the past. And I look forward to how they will mature and how we will begin to take those emerging technologies and build strategies around that.
For sure. All right, so final question, because we've talked about this space as very much being driven by emerging technology, but there's also this piece of competitive endurance, which is avoiding operational surprise, which also is kind of driven by technology that maybe you didn't anticipate, right? So both of those, to me, require a certain level of horizon scanning and understanding not only what is out there in terms of technology, but what's the next technology. So as you kind of look farther out at where the tech is headed and what is evolving, are there specific technologies that you're particularly excited about, or are there emerging tech? Is there emerging tech that you think will really move the ball forward in SAML?
I'm going to go back to refueling.
Okay.
It sounds like perhaps it's a basic concept, but it is also a prerequisite to so many other things. When we can refuel, we shift paradigms in terms of how we operate. And so that is perhaps the one capability that I watch with greatest interest. When we can do that with regularity, we can now begin to design our satellites differently. When we can remove a satellite, repair a satellite, it's just fundamentally game-changing in terms of the things that we want to be able to do. And so I'll circle back to terms that we threw out, like dynamic space operations and some of the other terms like maneuver without regret, what have you. My ability to not be fixed and to be able to be constrained to what I will call racetrack warfare, where it's just this thing. If I'm not constrained by that, the possibilities of what we need to be able to do are endless. The ability for me to be able to have mission assurance change fundamentally, because I can now do things that I could never do before in terms of ensuring that the things that I want to be there can be there. We have to remember some important things. The architecture, perhaps, if I can say, of today, was designed within the construct of space for peaceful purposes.
Sure.
The architecture of tomorrow, vis-a-vis SAML and some of these other capabilities, is one where we recognize space as a warfighting domain. And as a warfighting domain, that means that things can be taken away from us. Our adversary recognizes the value that we place on space and recognizes how that contributes to our asymmetric advantages. And they don't want to have a fair fight. And so they're going to look for asymmetric ways to take that away from us. And so SAML will play in a way that contributes. And we also have to recognize that the adversary will try to figure out how to use that in a way that takes away. That will be our future as we go through this natural action-reaction tension on how to use SAML within the confines of DoD. But lest we forget, there are extraordinary possibilities from a commercial perspective. And there are also extraordinary possibilities from a DoD perspective.
Sure. It's almost like we're going from racetrack warfare to Mario Kart warfare.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, Colonel Gardner, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you today and to have this conversation for the Space Policy Show. So thank you so much for joining us. And back to you, Colleen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to the Colonel and Margaux for participating in our show. This is a great way to end the series on ISAM. I really look forward to seeing how things play out for this integration of commercial and military space, as well as how standards and guidelines continue to develop for industry, that kind of balance between certainty and innovation that they need. Thank you to our audience for your continued support, and be sure to engage with us on social media if you like what we do. You can find other episodes in this ISAM series, as well as on other topics, on our YouTube playlists or wherever you get podcasts. And of course, you can browse the Center's research, as well as other shows outside of the ISAM series at csps.aerospace.org. Thank you to James Liggins, our technical director, and thank you everyone for joining.